So today I wanted to speak, as Jagannath Prabhu was saying, about Srila Prabhupada, and the title was Srila Prabhupada, No Ordinary Guru, No Ordinary Acharya. And I would like to start actually with asking the question, not that you have to directly answer, but sort of a rhetorical question, if you like. And the rhetorical question would be, who is Srila Prabhupada? Jagannath Prabhu mentioned about the Lilamrita, so we can read the Lilamrita, and of course subsequent to the Lilamrita there are so many other biographies from Prabhupada disciples, and they're talking about Srila Prabhupada and their pastimes with him, their experiences of him, etc., their meetings with him and exchanges with him and all of that. So in that sense, you know, we can get a very good picture as to who Srila Prabhupada was. But diving even in deeper and trying to understand, not just, yes, we know he came on the Jaladuta in 1965 and he set Iskcon up in 1966 and started to preach Krishna consciousness, etc. in the West, translated all the books that he translated and all of that. But who was he? What was the arrangement? And, you know, what was Krishna's plan, etc. and all of those things? What's behind it all? It wasn't just, you know, we know this wonderful verse from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Na Yasha Kahi Chidrajan, that nobody knows the plan of the Lord, but of course everybody knows that he has a plan. And even though great sages have studied it or considered it for since time immemorial, really, that they're none the wiser. So to get some idea of Srila Prabhupada, how he fits into that whole picture and the whole firmament, if you like, of Gaudiya Vaishnavism historically. So, and important, of course, because, you know, understanding how it will help us to understand how crucial his message and mission was that he came to give like that. So really, from, you know, different research, etc., and that I've done, and, you know, and obviously in conversation with other devotees and all of that, it seems to start way back in the Padma Purana. And of course, the Padma Purana can be dated to, you know, over 5,000 years ago. But everything contained in it can predate that considerably. But at least we know this is more than 5,000 years ago. And there was a conversation that took place between Bhakti Devi and Narada Muni. So Bhakti Devi is, you know, non-different than Srimati Radharani, and Narada Muni needs no introduction to all of us. And Bhakti Devi was speaking to Narada, having this conversation with the Narada Muni, and she spoke this following words, or this verse, Idam staranam parichaja videsham gamyate maya. And there's three key things. Well, basically the verse is saying, I'll leave this place, Vrindavan, I'll travel to faraway lands where I will preach the glories of Bhagavatam. So the three key things that she's saying there, as it relates to Srila Prabhupada, is I will leave this place, Vrindavan. That's where Srila Prabhupada left from when he came to the West. I will travel to faraway lands. From India, from the UK, if we stick a needle through the globe of the earth, you come out somewhere in Australasia or Australasia. If you do the same with India, and stick that needle straight through the center of the earth. Would need to be a big needle if you were to do it in real time. But if you were to do that on a globe, you would come out somewhere in America. So Srila Prabhupada, literally when he left Vrindavan, he was traveling as far away from India as he possibly could when he arrived in America. So I'll leave this place, Vrindavan, travel to faraway lands, and I will preach the glories of Bhagavatam. So, you know, when Srila Prabhupada left India to come to the West, he brought with him, you know, a change of clothes. He brought with him a bag of granola. He brought an umbrella with him as well, actually, which was interesting for the East Coast of America. And, you know, he brought some incidental bits and pieces like that. That we all do when we go traveling. You can be sure that Prabhupada was traveling exceptionally light in that sense, quite amazing as well, exceptionally light. But the one thing of real significance that he brought with him to the West was a trunk of Srimad Bhagavatams. They came with him also. And also, when Prabhupada started to establish centers, the first one being the Matchless Gift Store on 26 Second Avenue on the Lower East Side in New York City, but then every center subsequent to that, he would establish the morning program. And one of the key parts of the morning program is the Srimad Bhagavatam class. So since Bhakti Devi spoke those words to Narada Muni 5,000 plus years ago, we have no knowledge of anybody ever doing what Bhakti Devi was predicting that she would do. We have no knowledge of that until Srila Prabhupada. So it's not unreasonable. In fact, you could argue that it's very reasonable and logical to conclude that those words spoken by Bhakti Devi all those thousands of years ago were actually predicting Srila Prabhupada, which is just quite extraordinary. You know, we were all born at some point on this planet of our mothers and fathers, etc. But I don't think anyone ever predicted. Maybe when when our mother became pregnant, then it was predicted. Well, mum's gonna have a baby. But I don't think there's any predictions going around anywhere. What to speak of predictions from such incredible personalities as Bhakti Devi, and what to speak of predictions that are dating back so many thousands of years. So really, it's quite an extraordinary thing, this moment when Krishna consciousness left the subcontinent of India and came to the West. Lord Chaitanya, of course, so that now we're talking 500 years ago, spoke the words Ebinam Sankatan Tikshna Kadaya Laya. And that verse is saying that I will take the sharp sword, very interesting analogy, the sharp sword of Harinam Sankirtan, that's what the sharp sword is, and I will root out and destroy the demoniac mentality in the hearts of the living entities. And then he goes on to say, Yadi Papichari, that however, if some sinful people, if some of them escape, and he also, in the translation of that statement or that verse is, if they escape and go to far away countries, far off countries, I think is the English that is used, then my Senapati Bhakta will come to give them Krishna consciousness. So Lord Chaitanya is basically saying that he came to root out that demonic mentality from the hearts of living entities. That's what he came to do. And he, of course, did that within the subcontinent of India, traveled all around India, as we know. But then he says, however, if some people escape, and I don't capture them with my sharp sword of Harinam Sankirtan, then my Senapati Bhakta will come and chase them, basically, and round them up like that. So again, it's a clear reference. You can make the case for it being a clear reference to Srila Prabhupada. And of course, Lord Chaitanya spoke the very famous verse that in every town and village, the chanting of my name will be heard. He didn't say every town and village in one country. He just said everywhere, every town and village. So that also hadn't been done by Lord Chaitanya. But then Srila Prabhupada came and did that. And of course, just on that point, and really for all of us as well, it's a kind of a good thing to consider, is that even though Srila Prabhupada did come and he really accelerated that process, and not only accelerated, but for the first time outside of India, he started that development of Krishna consciousness and the chanting to take place in every town and village. But still, somebody told me actually, not so long ago, I think somebody told me that I'm terrible for remembering detail actually, so apologies, because I was quite surprised, but I think somebody told me there was somewhere, it was definitely a five figures, whether it was 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 or more, that I can't quite remember, but it was definitely 5 figures. It was more than just, a 9,000 figure. It was into the tens or more. Villages in the UK. That's how many villages there are in the UK. Someone maybe can Google it and tell me that's completely wrong, but I definitely have that in my brain that somebody told me that. But how many of those villages has the chanting of Hare Krishna actually taken place? Actually, Ananta Purushottam, who's kind of connected to the manor, he, during the 50th anniversary of Iskcon UK, he decided that he would bring a Harinam party to 50 towns in the UK where, as far as he was aware, Harinam had never been brought. Devotees had never gone there in Harinam. And they're towns, what to speak of, villages. So basically Srila Prabhupada started this process, but he has been so very, very kind he has left lots of that service and lots of that work to be done. Then, of course, there's the other famous quote from Bhaktivinoda Thakur, which was printed in the Sajani Toshani in, I think, 1885, I think it was, where he was saying that, very soon the unparalleled path of Harinam Sankirtan will be propagated all over the world. Oh, for that day when the fortunate English, he mentioned the English, he didn't mention the Irish, the English, the French, the Russians, the Germans, etc., Americans, will take up madongas and cartels and raise kirtan throughout their streets and towns like that. So all of these predictions and statements going 5,000 years, 500 years, 150 years ago, etc., it's very hard not to conclude that they were all predicting Srila Prabhupada coming to, in particular, coming to the West. And Prabhupada was such an extraordinary personality. We know how easy it is in our individual lives to kind of lose confidence sometimes and to become a little morose or a little depressed or whatever. I mean, they talk about during this pandemic, they seem not to talk about much else actually, other than, people's mental health. And of course, that's important. We don't want people to be suffering on the mental platform. Although, we also know, pandemic or no pandemic, Udared Atmanatmanam Natmanam Uvashada, that our mind is our greatest friend or our worst enemy. And it's our greatest friend when we control it, and it's our worst enemy when we don't control it. So whether it's a pandemic or not a pandemic, mental health is really has a lot to do with our ability, all to do with our ability to control it and make sure it's not dictating to us. But anyway, it's easy for us to lose confidence and all of that kind of thing. But Srila Prabhupada, amazing. Here he is at 70 years of age. He's come to the West. He's still on his own. Nothing has really started or nothing has really happened for him yet. And he's sitting in a park one day, and he used to go to the park on a regular basis. And, he's sitting on a park bench, and a gentleman, I think his name was Mr. Rubens, I think was his name. Yeah, I think Ruben or Rubens. And he worked on, I think, the New York. Anyway, he was involved. He worked for the kind of travel company, I think the Underground or whatever. And he would see Prabhupada. And one day he asked him, who are you? Like my first question, actually, rhetorical question, who is Srila Prabhupada? So he basically asked Prabhupada what he was. And in the course of that conversation, Prabhupada made a statement along the lines of, he said, I'm not a poor man, because obviously I guess people could see that, you're an old man, you're sitting on a park bench, I see you here regularly, maybe they're thinking he's some kind of vagabond or something. And Prabhupada says, I'm not a poor man, I'm actually a very rich man. And this was a little bit after explaining, I think, his mission. And he said, there are temples and books, they're existing, it's just time that is separating them. So this was before Prabhupada had done anything, translated any books, opened any temples, all of that kind of thing. But his supreme self-confidence, which was coming, of course, from, an incredible dependence and faith in his spiritual master, and of course Lord Krishna like that. But just amazing, that he would have that, such surety in what he was doing and confidence that it would be successful like that. So that was in the very beginning days. It was a year later. It was roughly a year after Srila Prabhupada arrived, a little bit more than a year, I think, wasn't it? Anyway, roughly a year after he arrived in America, that he actually established Iskcon as an entity, as an official legal entity, established Iskcon. That alone is an amazing thing. We were just talking before I started with a couple of devotees, Jagannath Prabhu and Rajanath Prabhu, and we were just talking about, in the future, Redbridge becoming like an official center, Iskcon center like that. Because it takes effort and it takes endeavor and it takes a certain amount of commitment and dedication to do those types of things. Because once you create a legal entity, there's all sorts of, administration required and accountancy required and health and safety stuff. And, there's a whole lot of stuff that goes with it like that. So here's Srila Prabhupada at 70 years of age. He had never left India. He spent his whole entire life in India. He arrives in a foreign country, America, which also isn't a Commonwealth country. So the laws were quite different. It wasn't as though he was coming to the UK, where Indian law and British law would be quite similar like that. So he was going to a completely new country at 70 years of age. And within a year, he's setting up a legal entity. And what does he call the legal entity? He calls it Iskcon. And what does the first letter in that acronym stand for? International. So he was like setting this up in New York City, but he was thinking big, you know, way beyond, you know, just having a center in New York City. So that was his mission. He came and there were different key steps that Srila Prabhupada took in creating, establishing and maintaining Iskcon. The first was what I've just said, the founding of the institution under the name of Iskcon. And the second was mentioned in the introduction, was the recognition of the founder, Acharya, Prabhupada as the founder Acharya, that organization, and also the name Prabhupada, the actual use of the name Prabhupada. Then another key step was the establishment of, and that was also mentioned in the introduction, the establishment of the GBC, or the Governing Body Commission. And another real key plank, which is coming to fruition now, which I'm sure must make Srila Prabhupada so pleased, was, I was going to say the acquisition of land at Sridham Mayapur to be our world headquarters. So Prabhupada did that himself, of course, but also then the construction of the Temple of the Vedic Planetarium. So they were some of the key steps that Prabhupada took. Now, why the founding of Iskcon? Sometimes, you may have heard it, sometimes some people will argue, why do we need an organization? Why do we need an institution? Aside from the point I made that, you know, there's an element of botheration with maintaining legal entities. But others will argue, why do we? Lord Chaitanya didn't have one. Let's just all go out on the streets and chant Hare Krishna like that. But actually we see that Iskcon, 50 years on or more from Srila Prabhupada establishing it, and there are other, you know, I mean, Iskcon's had its troubles over the years, and, you know, some groups of devotees have kind of, you know, gone away and kind of done their own thing and this and that. You know, there's been lots of that over the last 50 years. But the actual reality is that in terms of impact, in terms of continuity, in terms of size, in terms of, strength, Iskcon remains the main, by a long stretch, the main Gaudiya Vaishnava preaching entity in the Western world. So Srila Prabhupada was very clear about that you need to be organized, you need to have a structure to build around and to fill out, etc. That's very much a requirement. If it's too loose and just everyone sort of doing their own thing, its impact and its longevity, you know, won't be as effective, won't be as impactful like that. But the reason for doing that, not to be lost, it's not just for the sake of it. The reason was to deliver pure love of God to suffering humanity. And that example, of course, he's taking from the previous acharyas all the way back, you know, to Lord Krishna. That's the goal. And we've always got to keep that at the forefronts of our minds. You know, Iskcon isn't a social club where we just come together and you know, have nice relationships and kind of, you know, just sort of chill out, if you like. Iskcon's mission is to deliver people from their suffering condition. You know, people are suffering like crazy. We've seen in the pandemic, that's just highlighted it. But regardless of that, people are suffering like crazy in the material world. That was why Prabhupada did that. And that's what he wants us to do. There is nothing that will please him more than us bringing souls out of that, you know, that darkness of material life and bringing them towards the light of spiritual life. That will please Prabhupada more than anything else. So to deliver the fallen souls, and Prabhupada's view was that an institution like Iskcon would be able to achieve that with united force over large spans, actually, of both time and space. You know, Iskcon, an institution, would be able to do that. And that's more or less what I've been explaining, actually. And as I've also mentioned, within a year or so of Prabhupada arriving in America, he had actually done that. so now the name Prabhupada, you may be familiar with this, some of you, or all of you even, but just to reiterate it, it's kind of quite nice, you know, that there's one lady disciple of Srila Prabhupada, Govinda Dasi, and one time, apparently, well, not apparently, this is I take it completely as truth. This is what she's told or spoken. That one time her husband had decided that he wanted to call her Govinda Ji. And it just so happened that Prabhupada was visiting, you know, around that time. He was visiting where Govinda was. I think it was in Hawaii, if I'm not mistaken. And when Prabhupada arrived, he asked her, sorry, she asked Prabhupada, she said, Prabhupada, is it okay if my husband, you know, calls me Govindaji? Or maybe she got her husband to ask. Anyway, one of them asked Prabhupada, you know, is it okay, you know, if we call Govinda Govindaji? And Prabhupada's response was very interesting, and you may find this interesting yourselves. I certainly found it interesting when I first heard it. Prabhupada said, no, because G is actually a third-class form of addressing somebody, which I thought was, because in Iskcon we have that habit, you know, it's almost a term of endearment or a term of affection that we refer to a devotee as G, you know, say, someone will come up to me and say, Hari Bol Praghosa G, like that, you know. But according to Srila Prabhupada, it's actually a third-class form of address. But Govinda Devi Dasi, very quickly, and it's always nice this when devotees pick things up very quickly, but when she heard Prabhupada say that, her first thought, and then she immediately said it to Srila Prabhupada, she said, well, Prabhupada, if it's a third-class form of address, why are we calling you Swamiji? Because up to that point, Prabhupada had been called Swamiji, as you know, from reading the Lilamrita and other books. And Prabhupada, of course, responded, you know, he never wanted, in that sense, the focus of attention to be on him and all of that. So his response was a naturally kind of humble response that says, oh, that's not very important. But Govinda Devi, she was, you know, she was on this now. She was on this. And she says, no, Srila Prabhupada, it's very important to us. It's certainly very important to me and very important, I'm sure, to all your disciples. Why would we want to be addressing you in a third-class way? So please, Prabhupada, you know, free us from this error and from this wrongdoing, free us from it, and please let us know how we should address you. So Prabhupada says, well, you know, you can say Gurudev or Guru Maharaj or Prabhupada, like that, you know. And then she says, well, that's three, Srila Prabhupada, which one do you think is best? And then eventually Prabhupada says, well, Prabhupada is nice, it's like that. And she said, well, okay, from today on, we will call you Prabhupada. Now, it is interesting, actually, because as you will know, before you take initiation, you have your Bhakta name. Mine was Bhakta Paul. And when you get initiated, it can take quite some time for devotees, you know, they'll still keep referring to you by your Bhakta name until eventually, after some time, you know, it kind of clicks and connects and takes hold. So it was the same for Prabhupada, and Govinda Dasi explained how she really had to work on it. She had to keep on pushing to get that cemented in the devotees' kind of understanding like that. So yeah, that was Prabhupada, and what one will I take next was, well, I'm looking at the clock actually, and I'm not sure that I will get through them all. I'll take Founder Acharya, and then I want to at least get to the GBC actually, and then I can take some questions. So no ordinary guru. You know, we can have music gurus, we can have you know, exercise gurus, we can have gurus for practically anything these days. But of course, that's not who Srila Prabhupada was, and that's why he's no ordinary guru. But also no ordinary Acharya. And, you know, it's interesting that the term Founder Acharya really it's quite rare, and our only knowledge of it is the Founder Acharyas of the Sampradayas like that. And of course, those Sampradayas, you know, the Sri Sampradaya with Lakshmi, you know, the Sampradaya, the Brahma Madhva Gaudiya Sampradaya, Lord Brahma, Rudra Sampradaya, Vishnu Swami, and the Kumar Sampradaya, the Nimbarka, they, you know, they're going back millennia and millennia and millennia. You know, this isn't something that happens every day of the week. There were two kind of relatively obscure references to Founder Acharya, and they're found in, we mentioned the Sajjani Toshini publication earlier, that Srila Bhaktivedanta Thakur I quoted from. then his son, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Srila Prabhupada's spiritual master, he changed the name. He gave it an English name, the Harmonist, because the idea was to connect with more people in India who English was widely spoken. So he thought it would be good to actually publish it, the Harmonist, in English. So in the Harmonist, there are two references by one of Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj's disciples, where he refers to Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj as the founder Acharya. However, those references were both in the edition of December 1936. And of course, it was in December 1936 that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur left this world. So it never gained traction, actually. But if you compare Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj with Srila Prabhupada, you can see so many similarities. Because Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj did incredible preaching also. He established 64 branches of the Gaudiya Math around India, etc. So he had done extraordinary preaching. And he'd also revived and reformed a weakened tradition, as we know after Lord Chaitanya left. Very shortly after, really, a matter of decades, certainly within 100 years, that essentially Lord Chaitanya's message his message, I was going to say movement, he didn't have a movement as such, but his message had become compromised and effectively been taken over by the Sahaja movement. And it was being, it become corrupted and all sorts of things. So it was Bhaktivinoda Thakur who really tried to revive that, and then followed on by Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj. So he revived that weakened tradition. Then he created a society, the Gaudiya Math, very much in his own spirit, like that, and to push this forward, the revival of the preaching mission of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He embodied actually the mood of those ancient and original Sampradaya Acharyas in, again, delivering pure love of Godhead to suffering humanity. That is the theme always with all preaching efforts. It's to relieve humanity from their material misery and the situation they find themselves in. He countered impersonal monism, and he restored the true theistic Siddhanta, and then spread that Siddhanta of theism very, very vigorously and very widely. And then I guess the most exceptional thing of all would be that he propagated the philosophy of Achinta Bheda Bheda Tattva, simultaneous one and difference, like that. So all of those things, in terms of reviving a weakened movement, in Srila Prabhupada's case, well, and I'll touch on that in a few minutes. In Srila Prabhupada's case, he did do that because the Gaudiya Math that his Guru Maharaj had established had also become weakened by that stage. But primarily, he did it in Iskcon. And that was not just a weakened tradition, it was no tradition, because there was no tradition of Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the West. And Prabhupada came and actually started it. So he didn't just revive it, he actually started it. And Prabhupada very much created a society in his own spirit. I mean, without Prabhupada, Iskcon wouldn't exist. It wouldn't exist then, of course, because he established it, but it wouldn't exist now without Srila Prabhupada. He very much embodied the mood of those ancient Sampradaya Acharyas in delivering suffering humanity. In his pranams that we chant every day, he counted impersonal monism, etc., and voidism and all of that. And in terms of the Achinta Bheda Bheda Tattva philosophy that was propagated by Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj's Guru Maharaj, what Prabhupada did was very famous. He talked about unity in diversity, which is, if you like, a modern day version of Achinta Bheda Bheda Tattva. This idea that there is so much diversity, that diversity is unlimited, but we have to unify that diversity. And in Iskcon, you see that we have so much diversity, but maybe we struggle sometimes with the unity aspect. So Prabhupada very much promoted that. And after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj left the world in 1936, the mission for delivering fallen souls, took a very strong blow like that. And Srila Prabhupada talks about this in his in a Vyasa Puja address that he gave in 1968 in Los Angeles. When he is addressed in 1968, this is only 2 years after he had established Iskcon 3 years after he'd arrived in America. And he was just speaking on that day, glorifying his spiritual master, but also very much giving a clear message to his own disciples, you know. And he said to them, a little bit like today, the rhetorical question kind of style, he said that, you know, I was born in a different family, and who knew that I wouldn't ever meet my Guru Maharaj, who came from a completely different family, who knew that I would come under his protection. And then he says, you know, who knew that I would come to America? And who knew when I came to America that you American boys and girls would come to me? And he said, these are all Krishna's arrangements. We cannot understand how things are taking place. Like I said earlier, nobody knows the plan of the Lord. And then Prabhupada went on to say that, you know, in 1936, he was doing some business. And then he decided one day, I think he says the 9th of December, that he would write to his Guru Maharaj. So on the 9th of December, 1936, he wrote to his Guru Maharaj, and he said to him, you know, my dearest master, you know, your other disciples, your brahmacharis, your sannyasis, they're all rendering you direct service. I'm a lowly householder, so I cannot live with you. I cannot serve you nicely. So I just don't know, how can I serve you? So you kind of get from that, to some degree, the Srila Prabhupada, he was kind of lamenting a little bit and maybe feeling a little bit out of the inner circle of disciples of his Guru Maharaj. They're all sannyasis, brahmacharis, associating closely together, and he's kind of agree, has to out doing work, business, etc. So you kind of sense that from the letter that he wrote. And then just 4 days later, he got a reply from Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, and Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj just said to him, you know, I was very happy to get your letter. I think you should try, this famous instruction, I think you should try to push on our movement in English. And then an amazing sentence Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj delivers. He says, that will do good to you for doing that, following your guru's instruction and engaging in some service. And it will also be very good for the people who will help you. So again, that goes back to the point I made earlier about every town and village. You know, we're the people that Srila Prabhupada has helped. We're only here today because of Srila Prabhupada. So the more that we engage in his service and in the service particularly of his mission, that's going to help us. That's going to be the greatest help that we can ever get. So that was on the 13th of December. And then on the 31st of December, Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj left this world. So it was only like, you know, two and a half weeks or something later that he left this world. So that was the last communication he had from his Guru Maharaj. And it was such a very, very clear communication. And Prabhupada says, so I took that order of my spiritual master very seriously. And if we strictly try to serve the spiritual master, his order, then Krishna will give us all facilities. Now that's another important point for us to sort of try to absorb. That we see Prabhupada and we think, wow, he's done all these incredible things. And then we kind of say, well, that's because he was Prabhupada. He was a Shaktivesha avatar, incredible. But actually what Prabhupada is saying there is that no, if we sincerely try to follow the order, and in the case of Iskcon, particularly Srila Prabhupada's orders, if we try to follow the order of the founder Acharya, then Krishna will give us all facilities. And we also can do extraordinary things. So Prabhupada goes on to say he tried in that spirit and gave me all facilities to serve him. Now I'm old. I've come to your country, you know, you're taking it seriously. We've got a few books now, you know, so we're kind of getting a little bit of foothold. Again, this was in 1968, with so many more books now and so many more books distributed. So then his final point was, on this day of my spiritual master's departure, you know, I humbly ask you to, and request you to execute the same order through my will. Will, of course, has two meanings. One is will, determination. And the other is a legal reference, and that brings me on now. I am going to stop now. I may go over 5 o'clock, just a couple of minutes, Vrajanath Prabhu, but I'll get to questions very shortly. So will has two meanings. That, like I said, determination, but it also has a legal meaning in the context of a last will and testament. And so that brings us on to the establishment of the GBC. It's the first instruction in Srila Prabhupada's will, that the GBC, the Governing Body Commission, will be the ultimate managing authority for my movement over Iskcon going forward. So why did Srila Prabhupada create a GBC? And he did so in 1970, by the way. That's when he his first attempt at creating a GBC. He had a few ups and downs in the interim, but that was the first attempt in 1970. Now, it goes back to his Guru Maharaj, because his Guru Maharaj did the exact same thing. He created a Governing Body Commission. Now, it's very interesting, this, because traditionally in India, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, etc., what happens is that when a spiritual leader, spiritual master, the head of the institution, prior to his departure, he will create a will, and in that will, he will name a successor. And it's always one person that he names as his successor. So that's a tradition that has gone back, thousands and thousands of years. That's how it was done. So when Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj decided to create not to give it to one person as successor, but to create a governing board, this was a completely new phenomena and a new concept to his followers and his disciples. And basically they really struggled with it, because it was so new, it hadn't been done before, for them it didn't seem to make sense, or, etc. Of course, one of the main reasons why Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj did it was that as Kali Yuga progresses, the challenge that we have is that everyone is prone to Maya's, everyone's always prone to Maya's influence, but even more so as Kali Yuga progresses. So if Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj had given his movement just to one person, and that person had became a victim of Maya, then everything collapses. So Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, on the basis of that, decided better to give it to a governing board, because they're not all going to become victim to Maya, certainly not at the same time, and unlikely that all of them are going to become victims. So that's why he did it. But because it was new, and they weren't, it was a new concept, they weren't used to it, etc., etc., they really struggled to implement it, and effectively they didn't implement it. And the Gaudiya Math, certainly hasn't excelled in the way that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would have wanted it and hoped that it would have excelled. And Srila Prabhupada states, on a number of occasions, he says that, that's the reason it wasn't able to excel and thrive was because they didn't follow the order of their spiritual master. So when Prabhupada created Iskcon, he definitely, three things. He wanted to follow the order of his spiritual master. The idea of having just one leader, particularly coming from the West, if it's going to be a Western person, is even more risky. They're even more likely to be, become a victim of Maya, as we've seen over the decades. But the third thing that's really key about it is that because the Western disciples, they knew very little. All they knew was from Prabhupada. They knew very little of anything about Gaudiya Vaishnava history. And therefore, for them, it wasn't an alien concept. They didn't have a concept. So it wasn't, so for them to be told to form a governing board wasn't alien like that. So in that sense, they had an advantage over Srila Prabhupada's godbrothers. So Prabhupada established the GBC, and somehow or another, for 50 odd years now, 1970, 1890, 2010, 20, so what's that, 51 years since the GBC was established, it's still functioning. Of course, everything can be improved and all of that, but it's still a united force and works together, cooperates together, and functions together like that. And as a result, Iskcon is still growing. When Prabhupada left, we understand there was like 108 centers. Now we know there's over 1,000 centers, and so many things you can count. But that's all Prabhupada's mercy. But particularly, it's the mercy of us following his instruction to work together as a united Iskcon, working under one governing board like that. And as long as we do that, as long as we follow Srila Prabhupada's instruction, and as long as we keep Srila Prabhupada in the center, then Iskcon will forever thrive. But once we stop following Srila Prabhupada's instruction, and that by definition would mean that we wouldn't have him at the center. Once we stop following his instruction, then by definition we don't have him at the center. Once that happens, Iskcon will struggle, and almost certainly will go backwards, and very likely would cease to exist at some point of time in the future. Whereas the converse, follow Prabhupada's instructions, keep Srila Prabhupada at the center, we will not just survive, but we will actually thrive also. Okay, I'm 3 minutes over the 5 o'clock, but I think I should stop now and see if anybody has any questions or comments that they'd like to ask.
Thank you, Praghosa Prabhu, for taking us through that. If anybody has any particular questions, we can certainly take them for Praghosa Prabhu. I thought maybe to get started, Prabhupada's position as a founder of Acharya is the term I've heard is preeminent. In other words, it's always there, and it's, you know, it doesn't need to be presented or emphasized in any other way, but it's always the case. So how do we understand and connect with Srila Prabhupada? Because I never met Srila Prabhupada. The future generations definitely won't meet Srila Prabhupada. So how do we connect with Srila Prabhupada? Because we, seemingly don't seem to have that physical connection to him. So how do we realize his position and have a relationship with him going forward?
Thank you, Prabhu. The first thing to say, by the way, is that reference that you gave, preeminent, that term, sorry, that you mentioned, preeminent, that's actually in relation to him as a Shiksha Guru, that he is the preeminent Shiksha Guru for the entire Iskcon movement for all time, So this does bring us onto the subject, the subject of, Diksha and Shiksha, etc. And, somehow or another, actually, just as I was mentioning earlier, by the way, that the advantage us Westerners have had over Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj's disciples, that we don't have any concept of successor acharyas and all that kind of thing. So for us, a governing board made perfect sense, The flip side of that, though, is that somehow or another, for us in the West particularly, it seems that we have a bit of a fixation on externals. And the Diksha Guru, the external manifestations of a Diksha Guru are more prominent than those of a Shiksha Guru. So Diksha Guru, for initiation, you'll have a ceremony, there'll be a big fire. I mean, even that alone for Westerners, to see fires indoors like that in the middle of, so it's very spectacular, colorful. You get a name, you get beads, there's lots of externals related to it. So somehow or another, the Diksha Guru has been seen as much more significant than the Shiksha Guru. But actually, philosophically, that is not the case at all. So Shiksha, of course, the Diksha Guru can also give Shiksha, but we can have many, many Shiksha Gurus. But the idea is Srila Prabhupada will always be the preeminent Shiksha Guru of all of us. And, it's such a simple thing, really, when you think about it, that I'm sitting here today talking about Srila Prabhupada and talking about Krishna conscious philosophy, but I wouldn't be doing that if it wasn't for Srila Prabhupada. So how can it be that anybody else's Shiksha, given that the Shiksha we give is basically, you trace it back, it's coming from Srila Prabhupada, how can anyone else's Shiksha be remotely close to being as important as Srila Prabhupada's like that? So that's the first point to make. The second thing you're saying about the physical thing, I've never met Srila Prabhupada. Of course, one thing to mention actually, that we're really fortunate that previous devotees like us wouldn't have, say for instance, disciples of, going back to our recent acharyas, Jagannath Das Babaji, etc., Gorkishore Das Babaji, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, like that. None of those personalities coming after them would have had, for instance, videos or audios. I think with Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, we have some original photographs, but that's as far as it goes. We don't have any audio. We don't have any videos. With Prabhupada, it's amazing. We have a whole library of audios. I think there's something like over 2,200 lectures of Srila Prabhupada's were recorded. And many of them are on video. So in that sense, although we haven't met Srila Prabhupada physically, we're actually at a much bigger advantage than many generations before us had. So that's one thing. I think the other thing to mention is that Srila Prabhupada himself stated many, many, many times that Vani is more important than Vapu. That was just, there's nowhere, I'm not aware, maybe there is, but I'm not aware of it. I'm not aware of any reference where Srila Prabhupada ever put Vani and Vapu on the same level, and certainly where he would have put Vapu above Vani. Always. Prabhupada, Shaktivesha Avatar we've mentioned, quoted by Bhakti Devi thousands of years ago, all of that, Prabhupada is an extraordinary spiritual personality. He's just an extraordinary spiritual personality. But he was such a down-to-earth person. He wasn't, you know, some kind of airy, fairy, sentimental, wishy-washy person, you know, talking about spiritual life in some kind of, you know, ooh. He was just such a down-to-earth, practical person, you know. So always he would say, Vapu comes and goes. Vani, following instruction. That's the real connection. If you want to know me, read my books. That's how you know me. Not, you know, going down to the shops and bumping into him, you know, in the checkout and say, oh, Prabhupada, hi, nice to, you know, I know what you're saying, Jagannath Prabhu, because I also think to myself, God, it'd been great to have actually met Prabhupada, wouldn't it? Just been great. But, you know, it's also clear to me that that actually ultimately is not so important. And the really important thing and the real connection that we can have, like, for instance, you know, you know, Prabhupada initiated roughly 5,000 disciples. And, you know, I think at least half of those disciples now, actually, I'm really speculating here, you know, but a significant percentage of them, whatever it is, 10%, 50%, whatever it is, let's say even say 10%, let's be generous, say 10%. You know, 10% of those devotees are no longer connected with Prabhupada through service. You know, they've kind of left and are not engaged in devotional service and they've gone back to material life. So there is no question that you and me and everyone on this call who's still chanting Hare Krishna, still engaged in service for Prabhupada's mission, we're more connected to Prabhupada than those disciples who are no longer engaged in devotional service. So yeah, the connection, spiritual life has no boundaries, no boundaries, no, there's no beginning, middle or end to spiritual life in that sense. So the physical body cannot in any way check the relationship that we will have, not just with Prabhupada, actually, with Krishna. We've never met Krishna. You know, it's like, you know, I think we probably have met Krishna, and we've also left Krishna. But you know, in our living memory, we've never met Krishna. So, but it doesn't mean, you know, that we can't have a connection with Krishna, etc., and all of that. You know, so yeah, Krishna's in our heart. You know, and you know, in that sense, the Paramatma is also one of our gurus residing in the heart, you know. So the connection with Krishna, connection with Prabhupada, it's live, it's real, and we will feel it. That's the other thing. We will feel that connection, and you feel that connection through doing service, you know. And like I said earlier, I think that was when we were talking privately, you know, that you know, Prabhupada, if you can give somebody a book, and even more, if you can get somebody to begin their spiritual life by chanting Hare Krishna and engaging in service, that will please Prabhupada more than anything else. And therefore you will feel that. You will feel that and you will have a connection with Srila Prabhupada.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions from anybody else? Rajat, did you have a question?
Yeah, sure. So I think it'd be nice to just give, I guess, an indication to those that have joined the call of the sort of work that you're involved in, just so that they know, because it's easy to say GBC and use these fancy terms, but you know, practically on a day-to-day basis, what keeps you busy? You know, what are the sort of decisions you're making, projects you're working on, that kind of thing.
Okay, so real quick, because we are running out of time, but real quick. The GBC body, the governing body commission, that's the collective group of GBCs, of which currently there are 30, we just made a new GBC actually, I think there's 36, I think there's 36 GBCs now. So there's two aspects to GBC service. One is your role on the body, the governing body itself, and that the work there is not related to the yatra that you're responsible for, and you know, it's dealing with global policies. Someone mentioned earlier about strategic planning for trying to do all we can to you know, to make the preaching mission as effective and as dynamic as possible. So all sorts of strategic initiatives like that. It's also, you know, trying to ensure that standards are kept, trying to keep Prabhupada in the center of the movement, and dealing with, you know, all the challenges that we face in relation to oh my gosh, now, and I don't really want to get sidetracked here, you know, but right now we've got a very, very difficult issue that we're trying to navigate through. And that is a statement. The South African Yatra in particular wants a statement from the GBC body in relation to, you know, Srila Prabhupada, you know, yeah, he made some controversial statements. We won't get into the detail of them. He made them. And they're wanting some kind of statement to basically explain those so that people don't take them the wrong way. And, you know, in the world we live in, those things are very, very challenging because, you know, unless you have spiritual vision, you see everything through the lens of beginning, middle, end, you know, through the lens of the body. You don't see that the body's, you know, you don't see that, you know, the spirit soul, you know, is the real us, and the spirit soul is the eternal us, and then these bodies are incidental. Who cares? Ultimately, who cares? But of course, people who are in bodily consciousness, they care an awful lot, you know, and therefore trying to get through to them a kind of transcendental message, you know, about Prabhupada and what Prabhupada's mission was, and that, you know, he was only interested in saving, like we talked about, saving people from the material world. The fact is, there are different races, and they are, from a relative perspective, you know, if you're born with blonde hair and blue eyes up in Sweden, that's considered a higher, you know, a higher kind of material birth than a dog, let's say. Let's not even put it on the human level. It's a higher birth than a dog kind of thing. But, you know, in our modern world, they don't want to hear about those distinctions. No, everybody's beautiful. Everybody's, yeah, on the spiritual platform. Anyway, without getting into all the ins and outs of it. So there's all those types of things that we work together as a collective body to try to get right. But then as an individual GBC member for the area that you're responsible for, then yeah, that's trying to ensure that all your projects, not my personal project, when I say your project, I don't mean personal projects, but the projects that you're responsible for, that they're going well, you know, and they're a combination of going well, standards are being maintained, there aren't any big issues, or if there are issues, that they're being dealt with timely. And basically working with the heads of those projects to ensure that that's all going well. You know, when the GBC was first established, well, in 1972, we had 12 GBC members. And at that time, each of those GBC members, they had 6 temples that they were responsible for. 6 temples. So currently I'm GBC for the UK, Ireland, you know, Sweden, Norway, Scandinavia, basically. And also Switzerland, and I think with all those countries together, I think there's in excess of, I think there's about 80 temples. So as we grow and expand, one of my main focuses in the UK, for instance, is we've created 5 zonal secretaries who kind of, you know, are directly underneath the GBC. And they deal with specific areas. So we have Janitai Prabhu dealing with, you know, London and the Southeast. We have Sutta Prabhu dealing with the kind of, what do we call it in the end? That was the complicated one because it includes the manor. So it's not such a big geographical area. What did we call it? North London Central. I'm just forgetting the name we've given it. But Sutta is one of those in that area. Then we have, you know, Prabhupada Prabhu up in the north in Scotland. Tarakunath Prabhu down in the southwest in Wales, because in order to manage the expansion, but also to actually propagate the expansion for it to ever increase, we have to keep subdividing. If we don't keep subdividing, we get stuck in a bottleneck like that. So that's kind of a big focus of mine, just to keep on subdividing and giving areas to people to develop, so that those areas. So for instance, as an example, you know, let's say Wales in the southwest. The idea would be, hopefully, that would subdivide in the not too distant future. And before we know it, the area of Wales in the southwest would become bigger. Just that area would become bigger than what the whole UK Yatra was, say 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, we had whatever the Yatra was. Now we want each area that we've broken down to be as big as the Yatra was 10 years ago. And then you keep doing that. And that way Krishna consciousness will ever increase and expand. So yeah, there's the international aspect, which is a lot of it is to do with policy and initiatives and working on those. But also, whereas locally, to some degree, you could argue locally, you know, you kind of do the same, just on a smaller scale, although you're not so much involved, certainly not with international policy, because the international policy is already set from the entire international GBC body.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And it was very nice to join you here today, Prabhus. We didn't get any questions other than from your two good selves, but maybe next time.
Yeah, no, I think everyone was really appreciative of the fact that you shared so much in your talk just before, and lots of food for thought as well. And I particularly love the reference to the quote from the Padma Puran. So that was very nice to hear. But there we're having this conversation with Narada Muni.
It's an amazing quote.
Very revealing. Yeah.
That was brought to my attention about 5 years ago, I think, that verse, and I was just blown away. I mean, it was like, wow, you know, because you could. I mean, you know, it's one of these things where someone could have written it last week and then pretended it came from thousands of years ago, because you think, how could they be so accurate? Leaving Vrindavan, traveling to faraway lands, preaching the glories of Bauda. How could it be so precise? You know, yeah, it's an amazing verse, actually.
Thank you, and you've highlighted very nicely who Srila Prabhupada is and who he remains in our lives, and like you pointed out and cleared up, he's the preeminent Shiksha Guru. In other words, we can always receive instruction from him, and ultimately, all of us are just carrying his message forward, right? So there is nothing else.
And on that note, please, there in Redbridge, keep carrying his message forward.
Oh, thank you. And by your encouragement and blessings and prayers and everyone's involvement, we certainly hope we can continue that and grow. So thank you so much. I believe we are at time now.
We are indeed.
And I wanted to express our gratitude to you for coming forward and giving your time. And we're happy that you could come digitally, and maybe one day you can come in person when the time is right.
I will take that as an official invitation, and I look forward to honoring it as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll be super happy to have you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.
Srila Prabhupada ki jai.